Thank you, Norad, for inviting me here. Thanks for the presentation. As mentioned, I will speak English, although I could well make me understood in Swedish in this room, I think. As a Swede, I also cannot but thank Mrs. Frafrud Johnson for making the comparison between Sweden and Norway as a parallel to the development between North and South Sudan. Point taken. Maybe it was a lack of history that you hadn't found the oil at that time. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about a new project on trying to measure democracy in a new way. I am based at Lund University, but as will become apparent, this is a project that involves scholars from a lot of different institutions and universities and other parts of academia. I have 20 minutes, so I have to be brief. Actually, they cut me to 18, so I have even fewer. I will present our goals, basic sort of our approach, and I will show you some examples of where we think we make a difference when it comes to measuring democracy. Our goals. You all heard about these, I assume. So there are a lot of prominent indices out there that we all use to assess democracy. And before I go forward here, I want to say this right away. We as academics, we love to hate these indices. So we always have complaints about all of them. But I wouldn't have been able to build my career if it hadn't been for those measures. So we're not here today to dismantle, get rid of, thrash, or anything like that. These really good efforts that's out there already to measure democracy. We just think that there is room for improvement. And that's sort of our most important message. Because these measures have some problems. So in terms of definition, they're pretty narrow. In terms of accuracy, it's just more or less one dimension having to do with elections, some liberties. We don't think the coverage is broad enough. We don't really know much about the sources at all time, exactly what goes into the coding process. The methods of aggregation are either unclear or not very well justified. There are technical problems having to do with encoder reliability. There's also a legitimacy problem here. And I'm not saying that there is a US bias in these measures, but it's a fact that the Freedom House is funded by the State Department. Polity is funded by CIA. And that at least creates an impression that there is a US bias. And that makes a legitimacy problem when you want to use these measures out there in the world. So one of the most fundamental things that we try to do is to go beyond the purely electoral notion of democracy. That's still the core of the way we measure democracy. We still think that's the most important core. But we also look into other dimensions, and then not only the liberal one, but also we look at things such as participatory democracy, egalitarian democracy. Are these rights really equally distributed in society? Deliberative democracy, what's the quality of public discourse in a democracy? Majoritarian, consensual democracy. So we really make an effort to go beyond this purely electoral core. So by one way of, by a metaphor, we could say that existing indices they tap into this narrow spectrum of the concept of democracy, whereas we try to cover the full spectrum. And then I also mean other things that we don't necessarily build into our efforts when we think about measuring democracy. We also have a standalone component on corruption. We have a standalone component on party institutionalization. We have a standalone component on women's rights. We even have an indicator anticipating some of the program after lunch on LGBT rights, although we're not really sure how to interpret that indicator because it's turned out to be a controversial question to ask in some countries in the world. So we really try to go beyond the purely electoral conceptions. So how then do we do this? Basically, we disaggregate this whole thing about democracy radically. At the maximum level down to 329 indicators. Some which we consider more factual. I should put citation marks around that word because nothing is really that easy to say that it's factual, but they are more factual. Here we use country RAs from the countries in question or centrally hired RAs at our universities to collect information. But the most important ones, the most problematic ones, the most fundamentally difficult ones to collect information on, that we call the non-factual ones, here we use country experts. So we actually try to found people living in and or studying the countries in question to answer our very specific questions, 177 such questions. And we try to collect 5 such experts for every single indicator and year, going back to the year 1900 to answer our questions. And when I said this, 2 years ago, standing in front of an audience like this, or 3 years ago, this was sort of an ambition. I still wasn't sure we could do it. Now I'm sure we can do it, because we actually have done it. We have funding now for 174 countries. They are covering most parts of the world. There are mostly micro-states in Oceania and things like that we haven't funded yet. Some Gulf states, as you can see there. 168 of these countries are finished, meaning we have collected all the information from the country experts. We're still cleaning the data and working on them. But 89 of them are completed and can actually be seen right now, as I speak, on our website. 2,351 expert coders has helped us to collect this information. And sort of on average, 3 out of 5 of these expert coders are actually from the countries in question that we ask questions about. So this amounts to some 15.5 million data points, which I think makes we can rest assured when we say that this is the largest database on democracy ever collected. So organizationally, as I said in the beginning, there's a lot of people, okay? So we're 4 principal investigators, 2 in Sweden, Staffan Lindberg and myself, 2 in the US, Michael Kopich and John Gehring. Some 15 project managers, a lot of RAs, and most importantly, for legitimacy purposes, we have the country experts that I mentioned. We also have the country coordinators. Those are mostly younger scholars helping us collect information on the factual things that I talked about. And 33 regional managers. They're mostly academics from the region. So they could be academics from, say, Lusophone Africa, responsible for collecting information and helping us draft lists to recruit the country experts. So in terms of ownership, this also makes us very, very different. This is just a picture of all the program managers and regional managers helping us to collect this data. In terms of funding, a lot of different funders. What makes this a very different kind of research project is that we don't only have the usual sources of research funding from our research councils in Sweden and Norway, for example, in Denmark, for example, but we have a lot of donor money there. And through international IDEA, we actually have funding from Norad too, for doing updates, meaning updating this to the year 2013 and 14 for 31 countries. Thank you, Norad. And I hope you like what you get sometime by end of March, so you can support us in the future as well. Because this is something, if we stop doing this, obviously, if we would stop in the year 2012, people will be thrilled for some time, but then this will basically be a dead thing, or maybe only interesting for research or academic purposes. So what can we say with these indices that we haven't been able to say before? Just some few examples. I mean, democracy is something that there has been so much talk about in terms of both what's driving it and what consequences it has. So there are so many important questions to ask and to answer when it comes to the concept of democracy. Is it important for economic development, or is it just a product of economic development? How important is it for war and peace, civil war, for other kinds of human development indicators, human health, quality of life? How important is it for ethnic identities, nationalism, class conflict, group gender inequality? If all the previous measures, and again, I'm not saying that we want to scrap them, but if all the previous measures have problems, and I think they do, that means that all our answers to these questions that we try to dig into using the most developed techniques we have within academia, all our previous answers might be flawed. So it's really important that we have the measure of the most fundamental concepts in place first. So this is just a little illustration of something we can say with our data. So how has this been developed over time? As a provisor here, this is just for the 89 completed countries. So for example, Western Europe is not part of this. There's been a lot of talk about this. This is the last 5, 6, 7 years in the Freedom House data, showing a downward trend. So basically, Freedom House comes up with a report every year now saying that democracy is in decline, it's in recession, it's been going down since the last year because of this and because of that. And we're not saying that's not true, but just looking at our average, we see a little development in that way in 2012, but not before that. And actually, when we update with the new data, I'm not sure we will see that. So maybe democracy isn't in recession. That's something we need to dig into. We're pretty sure that it's also not the case that it's just going up and up and up, which polity is giving the impression it does. Another thing, going back in history, looking at polity, for those of you who know that, it's a US-based measure of democracy. One thing that's really flies to your face when it comes to polity is that they totally disregard the extension of the suffrage. So if you look at the line for Switzerland, for example, nothing happens when in the early 1970s. If you look at the United States, nothing happens in the early 1960s. They're just scored top, all of them, which is, of course, not really the case. For legitimacy purposes, this is also very important. So we recognize this. The fact that we're not only US-based, the fact that we have most of our funding from European and Scandinavian sources really makes a difference when we want to attract coders, country experts out there. They really want to help us. And one thing that they really like to hear and see is this. With these new measures, it's not the case, this is again, polity just an example, that all the Western countries, and of course, being in Norway as a Swede, I didn't pick either Norway or Sweden, but the other brother country, Denmark. It's not the case that democracy is flawless in our countries either. When we dig down here, when we subdivide democracy into these different versions, liberal, participatory, and so on, there are problems with democracy also in our parts of the world. This is just a short illustration of that. Polity, I already mentioned, has this problem with being scored too high in many instances. Look at Zimbabwe during the Ian Smith regime, for example. They totally disregarded the fact that there were so little part of the people that actually were enfranchised. Same problem in more or less in Namibia. Look at India. Look at Colombia, having huge problems with civil war. Polity is totally disregarding that. When it comes to Freedom House, we're actually seeing a sort of different development. Freedom House seems too low. What's going on in Brazil in the 1990s? You have this deep dip in the polity measure, Freedom House measure. Same in Kenya. So this sort of seems to reflect some kind of maybe political stance from Freedom House's sake. This is, we had a multi-party election for the first time. Sounds really promising. It must be going up. But then nothing really happened. So we're disappointed. And then in 2002, yes, the opposition won for the first time. It must be going up. Our coders don't really reflect that. India, what's going on in India in early 1990s? This is probably the fact that Freedom House didn't like the rise of the BJP or the communal conflicts that arose in the country. Nicaragua, what's going on there? I'm not saying that Freedom House is necessarily wrong. I'm just saying that there is something there that makes a difference if you use our approach. And this can make a huge difference when we try to answer all these other research questions. Another thing that we can do that's pretty much unique to our approach is that we can drill down. And this you can do yourself. Now, you can just log on to the webpage if you don't want to listen to me. To drill down. So basically, you could get a measure of, this is just a measure of electoral democracy in one country, Ghana over time. The shaded line there, that's our measure of uncertainty. That's another thing that we think is important. So not all coders agree, of course, in their answers to all our questions. We use that coder disagreement to get a measure of how much uncertainty is it around the point estimates. One other thing you can see about Ghana that's pretty amazing is, see, the line extends way back before independence. That's another thing we do. With the help of our great coders, we can actually say something about what was going on in countries even pre-independence, to the extent they were, units that could be treated as such. So what's going on? Why is this index, which is a composite index of a lot of indicators, why is it going up and down? That's something you really want to know. So if this was online, I could just click on that line, and I could get it divided into two lines. Because that index is at the highest level made up of two components. One having to do with elections, and of course during colonial times there were no elections, so in that sense there were no democracy whatsoever in Ghana. There were, however, some freedom of expression, and that's what that red line expresses. Okay, but we could click on that line to drill down one level further. That would give us 4 measures of electoral democracy. The extension of the suffrage, how developed freedom of association was, whether the elections were free and fair, and whether the executive is elected. And by looking at this, we can see that the most fundamental problem for electoral democracy in Ghana right now has to do with the elections. Suffrage, no problem. They have an elected executive. Freedom of association, not that much of a problem. But they still have these problems, mostly having to do with vote buying and illicit practices at the polls. We can actually, and this is just the freedom of association thing, dig even one level further. This is down at the indicator level, and I just choose one of the subcomponents now. The whole index, and this is just one out of 5 indices we're now producing on the website. This is made out of some 40, 50 indicators. So we could see more exactly what is it that's going on. So we have no real problems with party bans, but something happens here during the end of the time period. There is some problems with the opposition party's autonomy, however, according to our coders. So, to sum up, the v-dem payoffs. We try to provide more valid data on democracy. And apart from the fact that we're testing this, the fact that you can actually look at these countries, you can look at these scores and these lines on the website and see for yourself, helps us in achieving that goal. We can make very highly specific comparisons. You can just take one indicator, having to do with female participation in civil society, for example, and you can compare that across a lot of societies. We say certainty there. I could as well as I've said uncertainty, because that's as important. We can provide a measure of how certain we are. And this is sort of that shaded line, but we also have our experts to self-assess how certain they are in their scores. And we try to use that as one other source of information for estimating uncertainty. We can do aggregation at multiple levels. So components, subcomponents, higher level indices. We make everything transparent. So you can see everything on the website, except one, of course, very important thing. The identity of the individual coders is never displayed. Sure, I know who my Swedish colleagues are who have coded Sweden. That's not really a problem, right? Apart from that, not even I can access the data and see who coded Zimbabwe, who coded Iran, who coded North Korea. That's really, really important. Other than that, everything is open source. And we try to use these as a thing that will build an international consensus. Our catchword is global standards, local knowledge. Thank you.